I learned something surprising during what was supposed to be a routine tax appointment. One of those mildly painful annual check-ins with your accountant where the numbers never quite align with your memory. We'd made it through the deductible chaos of my recent home renovations and had moved on to lighter small talk when the topic of immigrant labor came up. Specifically, the men who'd been out at my home last summer, braving the sun and swinging hammers on my new roof like it was a calling. I assume they're off the books, right? I said, naively, I now realize. I mean, they're clearly being exploited. Nobody's out there sweating for 10 hours a day unless they're being squeezed. My accountant, a man whose sense of ethics is rivaled only by his taste in bourbon, raised an eyebrow and leaned back in his chair. Not true, he said flatly. What followed was a lesson I didn't expect. Turns out, one of his other clients owns a construction and landscaping business that pulls in over $5 million a year. The company hires between 15 and 30 Latin American workers each season. Every single one of them, he explained, is here legally, on H-2A or H-2B visas or simply an ITIN number, not the H-1Bs reserved for software engineers and pharma scientists. These guys are not dodging ICE. They're filing W-2 seconds. I looked at him, genuinely confused. But he gets them cheap, right? Nope, he said. They make between $40,000 and $60,000 for about 9 months of work. And if they're on a union job, he pays dues for them. It's all above board. He wasn't just throwing numbers at me. He pulled out a few anonymized W-2 seconds from this client, enough to see the range was real. $47,215, $53,782, $59,001, all legit, all legal, all men who spend most of the year laboring in brutal conditions, laying pavers, installing irrigation, planting and pruning and hauling and building, and then return home with earnings that, in parts of Central America, qualify as transformational. Here is the stunner. They pay federal taxes to the tune of $66 billion a year. That's $313 billion with a B over the next decade. These undocumented workers get what is known as an ITIN number. They can only get it through their employer. The benefit to the employer is when an employer files 1099s for workers with ITINs, they can still deduct that labor as a legitimate business expense. This is huge for companies in construction, landscaping, agriculture, hospitality, any industry with seasonal or physical labor. Of course, it's not easy. My accountant described the visa process as bureaucratic waterboarding, and only those employers who are determined tend to make it work. But once they figure out the system, they stick with it. The labor is consistent, the wages are fair, and the loyalty is off the charts. I never really dug into what was behind the rhetoric surrounding immigration. I had assumed these men were on the margins, underpaid and undocumented, hustling under the radar because they had no other option. But it turns out most of them are more gainfully employed than a good chunk of Americans I know, and pay federal taxes. Then came the mind chime out of nowhere. Maybe the loudest anti-immigration voices aren't scared of border crossings at all. Maybe what really terrifies them is the prospect of a legal, mobile, hardworking labor class that earns a fair wage, because that threatens the whole idea of an American underclass. Maybe Trump's fixation on illegals isn't about safety or sovereignty. Maybe it's about preserving a domestic workforce that's desperate enough to accept stagnant wages, dead-end jobs, and whatever patriotism will keep them from asking why their neighbor just made $55 an hour pulling weeds better than they could and with pride and dignity. Maybe like a love letter from Kim Jong-un, who keeps his population obedient and on the verge of starvation. Trump agenda is purely about crushing American labor. In a twisted way, suppressing legal immigration might not be about keeping people out, it might be about keeping Americans down. And the irony is not only will the government lose $450 billion in tax revenue over the next decade, but it will also spend $45 billion on a new prison network to cage these workers in America without due process along with anyone else who decides there is something really wrong with this administration. Anyway, I walked out of my accountant's office that day feeling less like a client and more like a student. And maybe, just maybe, like someone whose understanding of work, wages, and who belongs where just got flipped on its head.
Subscribe to Carl's channel if you like what you see, hear, or read. Mind chimes are not easy and take serious work. So if you read on Substack, watch on YouTube, or listen wherever you get your podcasts, let's support Carl's obsession.